Welcome to Jive with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, I am here with Rabbi Ari Jun-Ballaban. Ari, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
So, I heard your name about 6 weeks ago. I'm imagining a lot of listeners have also heard your name because you were first invited to speak at an anti-neo-Nazi march in Cincinnati, then you were disinvited. Can you just unpack that?
Yeah, I'll give you the real short version of it. I would say it's like 2 months ago now. There was a group of neo-Nazis that demonstrated in our area, which really freaked out the Cincinnati community for all the reasons a person might expect. Um, in response to that, there was an anti-neo-Nazi rally planned. I was actually organizing a group from my synagogue to go, and the organizers asked if any faith leaders would be interested in speaking at the rally. I volunteered because I don't know, it's an issue that's very important to me for reasons I imagine most people could guess. Um, they accepted my offer. I was put onto the schedule, and then a few days before the rally was supposed to take place, I got a message saying that I had been asked not to speak. In fact, the way they initially framed it was that they discovered some things about me that made it seem like my values didn't align with theirs. What came out in very short time was that what they discovered about me was that I was a Zionist and therefore not welcome to speak at the rally.
And so then, of course, this reached, somewhat national, at least national Jewish news. What was the fallout? I mean, was there any self-reflection on their part once it became clear? I mean, because it's obviously extremely, there's one angle where this is obviously ironic, in all the ways that people are pointing out, meaning, you're disinviting a Jewish leader from speaking at a neo-Nazi march. Was there any follow-up with the speakers there, or did it just, I don't know, lights out and you didn't hear anything from them?
What's interesting is that there were three organizers of this rally, and it seems that two of them sort of went rogue and did this on their own without involving, consulting, even informing the third. The third actually did reach out to me and express a lot of shock and disappointment at this, but apparently not enough that they were able to put the genie back in the bottle. Um, and then incidentally, I mean, I didn't wind up going to the rally because by the time this all really blew up, it became clear to me that it wasn't a wise or even necessarily safe space to be. But I did see some videos of the rally, and it really turned into um, almost single-mindedly an anti-Israel rally, which is unfortunate. I very much am okay with critique of Israel, but I think that there is something independently important about coming together as a community to oppose Nazis. That this does not need to be a space where we focus on attacking Israel. People can create those spaces. That's not what this one was supposed to be, but you know, if
Yeah, there's
things
been a lot of
happen.
interesting, op-eds written in the last couple of years about how focus on the Holocaust and Nazism is actually leading to anti-Semitism. I think the criticism might go even a little bit deeper than people on the far left see Jews as, or Zionists as the new Nazis, but really just this idea of obsession with hate having to be reduced to the anti-Semitism that the Nazis perpetuated, which ends up becoming so broad and universalized that you can then get a situation where people unironically disinvite a rabbi. I mean, I don't know much about your background, but I assume, you're somewhat liberal when it comes to Israeli politics. So not even I don't think you're hanging out with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir on the weekends. And,
Not
even
so much.
disinviting somebody like you who, you know, is probably in the, I don't know, 50th percentile of, on the liberal side of Zionism in the American Jewish community. So I don't know. I mean, do you think that, because on the one hand, this is problematic, not just for the anti Semitism reason, but it also seems like it pits this false dichotomy of if you want to be against Nazis, you have to be far left, which of course is not going to solve anything. And I think, just talking to a little bit more of, what we're seeing today with American politics, it seems like, it's not hard to see how that then drives people to the right. In other words, if I'm disinvited to speak at the local anti-neo-Nazi march, and I can imagine, I mean, I would imagine Cincinnati's a little bit different than Southern California, but generally, if somebody said there was going to be an anti-Nazi march here, this is probably not the connotation in the Midwest, but I would assume what they mean by anti-Nazi is not real Nazi, right? Anti-Trump, anti-fascism, all things that I'm, could probably get on board with a march against, but it starts to blur the line of exactly, who and what is a Nazi, and it ends up pitting the sort of people that are proud anti-fascists or anti-Nazis as, more and more fringe left. I mean, I'm curious, I mean, has this, both on a universal level, just for you thinking about this, but has this changed your politics and your identity with, certain progressive groups at all?
I've been reflecting on that a ton since all of this took place, and I think the short term answer is it still hasn't. I find myself more frustrated with the behavior of people on that fringe left because, I mean, I've been seeing things like this happen for a while now, like I think many of us, but experiencing it firsthand is different. And so my frustration has grown, but I don't know that my particular personal political positions have changed. I don't know that my self-definition has changed since this all occurred. Um, it's funny the way that you frame this, or funny is probably not the right word. It's interesting the way that you frame it, though, because the language that was used in this whole situation was that, this is a response to Nazism. Nazism is a form of white supremacy. Zionism is a form of white supremacy. Therefore, a Zionist is anathema to fighting white supremacy. And that was all of the background, the reasoning that was needed to say, in effect, if not in explicit language, most Jews aren't welcome here at this anti-Nazi rally.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm still only because I'm gonna, I very much don't hang out in progressive circles. So, most of the time I talk about progressives, I want to make sure I'm not straw manning it. I have a lot of friends who are conservatives and a lot of friends who are classic liberals. For a variety of reasons. I don't hang out with a lot of progressives necessarily. Do they think they're doing, I mean, are they at all aware of the tension here? I mean, I imagine most progressives are reading this and thinking, oh my God, this is crazy, this makes progressives look terrible. But just this, equation, or what, some strange Talmudic transitive property of this is this and this and this, and therefore all of a sudden Zionists aren't welcome. I mean, I don't know. I mean, is there any, because there is this fear, I am teaching a class on American Jewish history now. So one of the things that I have the students do is look at the website of different Holocaust museums, because I just find it really interesting. How does the Museum of Tolerance in LA versus the DC Holocaust Museum versus Yad Vashem in Israel, how do they talk about the Holocaust? Is it talked about from an American-centric perspective? American being the heroes. Is it talked about as a, this happened to the Jews, here's why we need Israel perspective, right? Obviously, you go to Yad Vashem, that's clearly the push. Is it talked about from just a, no, let's talk about the, just the pure evil, right? That's more the Museum of Tolerance in LA. And what's interesting here is this is a version of Holocaust remembrance that it's almost become so essentialized in some way as you can represent anything with it. Meaning, because you
Yeah.
also see this with people on the far right, of course, both in Israel and in America, where they say, well, anybody who criticizes Israel strongly, well, they're also part of the Nazis, right? You see this criticism on the far right in Israel of, American college students that are being critical of Israel. In America, you say, well, the Democrats are overreaching so much, and this is, originally what the Nazis did. And you get to this finger pointing where sort of everybody is Nazis. And meanwhile, there are quite literally people mostly on the far right, but also on the far left, that actually do hold tenets that would be very akin to Nazism in terms of, their view of Jews. And it's almost like those people, I don't want to say are getting a free pass, but, for me, in 2020, I guess, I'll put it like this, because I've been on campus for the last 8 years, in my capacity as Hillel and teaching on campus. The worst thing that one could be called on campus for your professional and sociability was a white supremacist, right? This was during the George Floyd protests, right? Anything to not be called racist or a white supremacist, which is good, right? We don't want a lot of white supremacists and racists walking around. But then over the last 2 years, something switched where people in the mainstream Jewish community got so used to being called white supremacists that the phrase essentially means nothing anymore. Meaning, if someone calls me a white supremacist now, it's not landing at all. It's the same thing as somebody says, I don't know, I don't like your sweater. It's like, okay, I just don't care. That's not, an interest. And so it almost switches the definition. It's much more of a fundamental shift because all of a sudden, 20 years ago, fighting against both Nazism and Allied fascism, that is something that 99% of Americans were on board with. Yes, we hate, the definition of Americanism in the post-war period was, we defeated the Nazis. And all of a sudden now, you're getting into these debates where people are saying, well, what do you mean by Nazi? Did Elon Musk really do the Hitler? So, all these things were and I think this is the fault of the progressives. The progressives are watering down people's, internal alarm bells when it comes to calling out these, clearly nefarious ideologies. And then the real Nazis are probably sitting there laughing because they're like, oh, haha, now nobody has any idea, if I say, I'm doing a podcast with a Nazi, it's unclear to most people, am I talking about, a genuine Nazi, or is it somebody that's, a little bit more right wing on American deportations than I am, or is it somebody who's a Zionist and I'm a left wing activist? And so I don't know. This isn't really a question, but this is just an overall frustration. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, Dr. Dara Horn, who, she wrote that infamously titled book, People Love Dead Jews. She had an article in The Atlantic, I want to say, this might be 4 years ago at this point. It's been a little while. And the title, I think, was something along the lines of, is Holocaust education making anti-Semitism worse, or something like that. I bet if you Google those combination of words, you'd find it. And I thought the premise was very interesting. I'm not convinced that Holocaust education is making anti-Semitism worse, but I'm also now no longer convinced that Holocaust education is the solution to anti-Semitism that Jews dreamed it was for like 50 years. That if only we expose people to better understandings of what happened to the Jews and what is Nazism and all of these things, it will help the Jews combat anti-Semitism. And I'm not also convinced that it even helps in combating Nazism, let's say. I think that there's an intrinsic good, but I should say, education on the Holocaust is really important to our society for a whole host of humanistic reasons. I say that all the more so as somebody who's a descendant of Holocaust survivors. But I don't think it's this like remarkably effective tool. And what I heard you say that really did resonate with me is this fear that Holocaust education may actually sometimes be making anti-Semitism worse, particularly, what's it they say, like a little bit of education is a dangerous thing. People get just this cursory introduction to anti-Semitism, fascism, Holocaust, and suddenly they have equipped themselves with new tools to label anything that they don't like in a remarkably pejorative way. Everything is a Nazi, everything's a fascist, everything's a white supremacist. When in fact, there are those real things that deserve our most strong critique. I would also say one of the things that that has struck me in this time, and I think you alluded to this too, is that we're finding that while Nazism is often branded a far-right phenomenon, the tactics of people on the far left so thoroughly resemble these days many people on the fascist far right that it doesn't make a tangible difference to the Jewish experience, which side they come from, that they're doing similar things.
Yeah, yeah, and also, I mean, I guess maybe slightly more pointedly, if we take at least the original Hamas charter, right, not their sort of edited version a couple of years ago, but
Sanitized,
the
yeah.
the tenets of that are probably the political entity or government that has the most similarities to what a Nazi-like regime was. I mean, obviously not to create a one-to-one parallel, but yeah, in some sense, a couple of years ago, what you said reminded me. I wrote an op-ed. This was when people were talking about deportations, and I think AOC went somewhat viral for calling the deportation center is a concentration camp. And, this is back when, I mean, I'm sure it's still, squalor and terrible conditions. And, I wrote an op-ed, and I don't know what I think about this op-ed, but I'll, sort of give the premise, and, we can unpack it together, where I basically said, I don't like that she's calling it a concentration camp, because most Americans have very cursory knowledge. There's some crazy statistic, 40% of Americans, barely know what the Holocaust was, and two-thirds don't know what Auschwitz is. And so if your, prime, I don't know, example or paradigm of what a concentration camp is, the border detention centers, which, are bad, but not, concentration camp, Holocaust level bad. And then somebody tells you, well, the worst part about the Holocaust were these concentration camps. And so then you're thinking, okay, I don't know, it just sort of creates this level in your mind. Now, the counterpoint, and I'll give sort of the other side, and then you can tell me which side you land on, is there's also some sense of, if we as Jews essentialize the Holocaust so much as, this is pure evil and nothing else can reach this evil, then essentially there's nothing to learn from the Holocaust, right? Essentially, it's just, this is untouchable almost on a different, qualitative level. And so, so there is this really, I think, intense debate of, if the Holocaust is the most evil thing that's happened, let's just posit it's the most evil thing that's happened in recent history. I'm sure there's been other very evil things, but let's just assume that's a premise. Does that mean that it's so evil that it's untouchable, because comparing any wrongdoing to the Holocaust is ipso facto going to lessen our view of the Holocaust? Or on the other hand, do we say, no, you can actually view things as a spectrum from, normal society to Holocaust bad, and you should actually point out if society goes from the 10th percentile to the 20th percentile. So I'm very torn with this, but I do see the slippery slope of what you get is now this reduced form of dialogue where, everything you don't like is, well, that's something that Hitler did. And, Hitler also, I'm seeing, with this week, and of course, what Trump has done with this, poor guy from Maryland is obviously terrible. And, but I've been seeing on social media, well, that's what Hitler did in the beginning, is he, came up with prisons that were, outside of Germany. Most of the prisons were, of course, in Poland. And this was sort of the original thing that he did. And, that's factually true, but the insinuation, I don't know, I always feel a tension there of, so I'm curious your thoughts here.
No, I mean, it implies that we're on the precipice of a Holocaust, which, God forbid, we should be on the precipice of such a thing. I mean, that doesn't mean that nothing bad is taking place. Before answering, getting into whether I think using the language of concentration camp is the right move, I'm thinking about the motivations of why Jewish folks I think Jews have had this tendency of universalizing the Holocaust, to try to make it, a broadly applicable set of lessons, that, speak to human nature and all of these things. And I think that tendency comes out of a really good place, which is wanting to create lessons that are adaptable to different settings. I also think it probably is at least subconsciously motivated by a Jewish belief, that if we focus too much on the particulars of the Holocaust, like that it was Jews who were overwhelmingly the targets, that people won't care, that we have to universalize this uniquely Jewish tragedy to make it something of interest to anyone else. And I don't, to the extent that that's the motivation from the Jewish camp that universalizes, I don't think it's correct. I think people, even though I sometimes am skeptical of human intelligence, I think people generally are capable enough of metaphorizing a particular tragedy, the plight of Jews during the Holocaust, and thinking about how that might speak more figuratively and broadly about other human experiences. So that's one of the things that comes to my mind. As far as the language of concentration camp, I was thinking about it just this last week for the exact same reason as you, which is, the creation of these, let's call them holding centers for the sake of some neutral language in the discussion phase before we reach the verdict. And see, I saw a lot of people using the language of concentration camp too. And I kind of went back and forth on it myself, that I think that's actually probably the technically applicable term, that, these are in the strictest of senses, concentration camps. And the concentration camps that led to the Holocaust weren't the first concentration camps either. It's just a thing that people sometimes create. But you're right that at least within American discourse, the quintessential meaning of a concentration camp is that Shoah meaning of concentration camp. So I do think it's misleading when that language gets used because it conjures an image that may or may not be relevant. I guess if people are trying to conjure that image, then you could have a discussion about whether they're doing the right thing. But I think to the extent that we use the language of concentration camp without knowledge of how it impacts people and what it makes them think of, we could probably be more precise in our language.
Mm. Yeah, like that. There, favorite quotes, about this tendency to want to universalize the Holocaust, which makes a lot of sense. But I actually start off most of my Jewish studies classes, which of course have majority non-Jewish students taking it. So whenever I'm sort of, the first class in my mind is like almost a pitch as to why they should care. um, and so, there's this famous quote from James Joyce, that the only way to reach the universal is through the particular. In other words, if you spend your life trying to understand universals without digging into anything narrow, you're going to be lost. But the theory is that, within any particular, you can sort of uncover universalities, which mean you actually have to spend time in the particular. And so I think, with the Holocaust, just graduated high school, and they say they spend about a week or 2 weeks in high school talking about the Holocaust. And they say, of course they mention Judaism and anti-Semitism, but they do it much more from the lens of, a modern political racist movement that's centered around hate, as opposed to, how I think if somebody gave me 2 weeks to talk about the Holocaust, my entire first class is going to be about the history of medieval Christian anti-Semitism through Martin Luther and German anti-Semitism through the Protestant Reformation, then hitting, Eastern Europe, Protocols of Elders of Zion, and then landing in Germany in the 1930s. And I think that's just the sort of obvious historical way to do it, because you can't really understand, why Hitler was so successful in scapegoating Jews without understanding all that background. And so if we just understand the Holocaust as, everybody's a little bit racist at all times, and this is what happens when people are super racist. There isn't much of a lesson. I mean, both in terms of the historical narrative, you don't really get it, but also, I don't know, it just creates this misunderstanding of, well, any day now, any Holocaust can just happen against anyone, and the answer is, well, no, not really, because the Holocaust did require about 1,000 years of baggage. There's one other sort of thing that popped into mind, then you can feel free which to dig in on. The way that early Israel, I'm not talking about the Israel of 2025, but Israel of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, approached this question was essentially the exact opposite, meaning, and this is something listeners are always shocked to hear, I'm sure but just to unpack it for listeners, Israel and the Zionist movement, more particularly in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, essentially wanted to pretend the Holocaust never happened. And when they did acknowledge the Holocaust, it was in contradistinction to the project of what the Zionists needed to accomplish. And I say this, as somebody who fully supports, the state of Israel and Zionists and whatever. So this isn't a moral statement. It's just descriptive, where essentially if you were to pop into, 1950 or 1960s, early Israel, the Holocaust this is what happens when Jews are too weak and meek to fight back. And this is everything that we're not, right? The Holocaust victims are the diasporic Jews who went like sheep to the slaughter. Again, this is not my view. This is the view you might hear in, I don't know, Tel Aviv in 1952. And this is in distinction to, the strong Sabra, IDF, soldier who's strong that would never go down without a fight. Of course, Yom HaShoah is not on, the liberation of Auschwitz. It's on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which, of course, is the one time, that it seemed like, this is somewhat of an uncharitable explanation, so this might not be completely right, but, for early Israel that was thinking, okay, we have to actually remember this. What are we going to focus on? The one time that, or at least the most famous time that we were actually strong and forthright. And so, Israel, I think, if I'm going to be charitable now, they in some sense were able to predict this trend of, if to Dara Horn's point, and people love dead Jews that you alluded to before, if people's main conception of Jews are as victims, then when Jews simply become victims again, it's not strange, right? It's almost, students are, might see the anti-Semitism on the streets and, on college campuses and you getting disinvited from this march and just thinking, oh wow, this is bad, but this is, history here, as opposed to Israel that was saying, no more of this. We're gonna, and so they obviously have a very different approach, which is much more of the sort of Israeli approach versus the American Jew approach. But this just popped into mind as well. I said a lot, so
No, I think about, I'm sure you've seen it before. I think it's a 2018 speech that Lord Rabbi Sachs gave at the House of Lords, where he gives like this he's talking about anti-Semitism, he's talking about anti-Zionism as well. He gives this remarkably brief summary of anti-Judaism throughout the years. Something to the effect of, I will do it no justice, they said, in the Middle Ages, they didn't hate Jews. They just hated that we didn't believe in Jesus. They said during the Shoah, they didn't hate Jews. They just hated our racial tendencies. And now they say, we don't hate Jews. We just hate their nation state. And again, ample criticism of Israel, which I think is a reasonable thing. But there was a meme that I've seen circulate around that goes sort of to the same point, which is there's a certain chutzpah that comes or is required to focus your hate and your attention and your ire on the same group of people whom historically folks have targeted their ire toward, and not to think that there's any connection between those things. So to say, listen, sure, there's a 2,000-year history of non-Jews attacking Jews for various practices and customs and ways of being. I also hate those same people, but there's no relationship whatsoever. Which is not to say that a person can't have some good faith critique of Israel, or heck, a lot of good faith critique of Israel. But a unique just fascination with, obsession with criticizing Israel the way that our world has it. I mean, I think that there's no other way to understand the global obsession with criticizing Israel other than knowing that there's a history of anti-Semitism in our world. Because Israel, for however many evils it may have, is hardly a unique evil. By the way, I just want to clarify, I don't think Israel's evil. But the ills of human nature that exists there exists in a multitude of other places.
Yeah. No, I think that's well put. I was gonna say, if you wanted to really do Jonathan Sachs, justice, you gotta feign the British accent there.
I am not even gonna try.
I love it. Yeah, it's also odd because progressives, and this is something that I think they brought into the mainstream that I actually do like that they're shedding light on, or have shed it, being a sort of one-to-one phenomenon. It acts within systems and societal systems. Yes, I think that's become a little bit overblown, but I think the general idea still stands that if you have hundreds of years of oppression against a certain group, even if many of the people change, and even if in some sense the laws on paper change, just the way that this weird concoction of law, society, culture, religion, all these things evolve, there's some fuzzy relationship of still you're swimming in some ether of a little bit of racism, even if there are no racists left. In other words, one can imagine, and I would, definitely argue for the affirmative, even if somebody can promise me, or they, have a crystal ball in, I don't know, 50 years, and they tell me there are zero racists left in America, there might still be racism because of systems that have been set up, and so it's sort of, it's odd that that same logic isn't applied to Jews, both within the context of the West and also within Christianity, and one might add Islam to that as well. But let's stick within Christianity for a moment of, now, of course, in 1965, the Catholic Church, had its very famous, the Jews didn't actually kill Jesus, stop blaming them. And of course, right now in America, the vast majority of Christians are not anti-Semitic. So, I'll get all those, out of the way. But still, as somebody who, again, studies, specifically Jewish history, but, my in grad school, I studied, Jewish Christian interaction, Augustine through, late church fathers in the late medieval period, just the same way that if somebody is, I don't know, you know, our text in Judaism, I always say this, and this upsets, my Orthodox peers, but there just is a sense of sexism within traditional Jewish texts. And I say, I grew up Orthodox and I grew up, fully, internalizing a lot of that. And I don't want to overblow this too much, but, it's just sort of obvious that if somebody grows up and every day, one of the first prayer I say in the morning is, thank you, God, for not
Yeah.
making me a girl, which is, literally in the traditional prayer book. And every day, the most important thing a male can do, this is in the yeshiva world I grew up in, is study Talmud. And women aren't allowed to study that because it's a waste of time. As at least one opinion in the Talmud says. This is more nuanced than I'm making it. But if somebody were to then say, well, I could exist as a Orthodox Jew and not be sexist, the answer is yes, of course. But Orthodox Judaism, there is obviously a little bit of ether of sex. Again, I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but I think for the last 1900 years to think that all of a sudden that just dissipates. It's shocking. Especially because I have these conversations on campus a lot, and just people are unwilling to see any connection. And there's always a reason why it's different. And but this time there are, I don't know, some Jews against. And I always think, I was talking to Professor David Graysboard, who's the head of Jewish Studies at University of Arizona. And he actually said this, not me. And I was surprised that he said this because he's a scholar of medieval Jewish Christian relations and the Inquisition. And he said at one point during the podcast, the Jewish, staunch anti-Zionists. I'm not talking about people that are, upset at, current governmental actions. They're somewhat similar to, Jewish defects to Christianity in the Middle Ages, which, if you look, Jews who converted because they had internal knowledge of the Jewish community that they can then use that against, it's always the most
Mm.
hurtful when, one of your own defects. And I think it's a really interesting parallel, but yeah, it is mind-boggling how and why people are unwilling to see this connection of, anti-Semitism has virtually been in every form. It's obviously, just to spell it out for listeners, in medieval period, it was a religious, this is to paraphrase Jonathan Sachs, obviously, and, 19th century, it was some vague idea of the, Jewish people, ethnic conspiracy. Then in Nazism, it was, purely race. And so now that, the mainstream Jewish identity is political, now it's in the form of politics. It just seems too obvious to even have to spell out. Yet I do think the anti-Israel world has actually done a very good job at obscuring this, and so it is frustrating.
I wonder, you say that the anti-Israel world has done a good job of obscuring this, and I think that you're mostly correct in the sense that to the non-Jewish community, it is quite hard to see. Um, I wonder if throughout history that same comment would be made, right? I wonder, to the medieval, European communities under Christendom, if it also felt disguised that like, oh, well, it's totally normal to hate those people. It's not because I hate them. I just hate that they have different beliefs than me. And I wonder if it felt similarly obscured during times like that, or if this is something new.
I think you're right. I think that is interesting. And I think I'll even up the ante. I'm not sure that there are probably very few people throughout history that thought they were actually doing something bad by being racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, all these things. I think, one can, not that you're defending it, but one can, using that logic, defend any type of anti-whatever of, I'm not against the essential human being behind this. I'm just against the fact that they are gay, or whatever, which, and so, but yeah, I think it is interesting. I mean, the other thing, I figure, we'll take advantage of your being in Cincinnati for a second, which just for listeners, obviously, was the center of the American reform movement for about, I don't know, what are we going to say, 50 to 70 years before it started moving to the coast. And obviously, HUC Cincinnati closed a couple of years ago, and sort of I don't know if you would say this, but sort of the final nail in the coffin of, Reform Judaism is now just as coastal of a phenomenon as, the other communities, which is there was a really interesting article a couple of years ago that talked about, it was called The PLO's Rabbi. I don't know if you've seen this. And essentially the argument was the American Pittsburgh Platform in 1885, which for a whole variety of historic reasons that might have made sense or might not have made sense at the time, one can debate it, very clearly said Judaism is a religion. We have no national desires. We have no desire to return to, Palestine. We have no desire for, any of the temple and messianic rights that, Jews have wanted. And this was the Reformed Jewish community in the 1800s was the biggest community, both in Germany and in America. And so the mainstream, at least American, Judaism in the 1800s, all the way through World War I, it was, reform, and then conservative Judaism started to grow a little bit. But your average American Jew in the year 1900 was not virulently anti-Zionist, but they were anti-Zionist because for them, they were attempting to fit in and assimilate. And, what worse way to assimilate than for people to associate you as, oh, this is Ari. He, he lives in America now, but really he's a part of this movement to actually, come up with a state over there. So he clearly has, dual loyalty and isn't, really proud to be an American, right? So a lot of Jews were kind of pulling back from that. And because this became the definition, this article was interesting because in early drafts of the PLO statement, which of course didn't come out until the 1960s, but they actually went back and quoted from a myriad of reform rabbis in America in the late 1800s to say, look, even the Jews say and admit they are not a nation, that they're just a religion. So therefore, and this is, I'm bringing this up because this is the most common thing I hear on campus, like, I have nothing against Jews or Judaism, what, Jews should be able to eat kosher food and, practice, celebrate Passover. And that has nothing to do with me being against this political entity that has nothing to do with Judaism. So I figured I'd bring that out and we can.
Yeah, look, it's a very interesting theoretical discussion that if Israel still did not yet exist as a country, and if close to half the world's Jews did not live in that piece of land, would it make sense for Jews to support the creation of a state of Israel and to push for Jewish emigration to that piece of land? That's a great hypothetical. It's a great what if, but it's not our reality. And that's, I think, what people who make this kind of argument either miss or intentionally obscure. I think in many cases there's a willful ignorance or dishonesty because the fact of the matter is Israel has existed for now over 75 years. In the scheme of countries, of nation states, that's actually a pretty decent while. That's longer than a lot of other countries that have been around. It's probably not going anywhere as a political entity, that just the way that the world works in 2025. And beyond that, look, if you're talking in 1820 and trying to decide whether Jews should move to Israel, and whether you want to have that as part of the global Jewish identity, great theoretical discussion. But in 2025, when there are 16 million Jews and 7 million of those 16 million live in Israel, 7+ million, it's a different set of calculus because effectively what you have to say that you oppose the existence of Israel as a nation state, you're saying I want the homeland, the nation state in which close to half the world's Jews live, to cease to exist. I want to create that kind of tumult for close to half of the world's Jews. I just don't think I'm not knocking the 19th century reformers, incidentally. Like, it made sense perhaps in that world. It was a great theoretical argument. There's a reason the debate stopped in the late 40s. And it's not just that the Holocaust took place, it's because the argument was over. For the 3/4 of a century now, it's a fait accompli.
Yeah, it's funny because I did not, grow up with any knowledge of the Reform Jewish community. And, I had all the stereotypes of Reform Jews that, you might expect from, the Orthodox world. And in studying a lot of the history of the Reform movement in the 1800s, I realized two things. One, I disagree with them more than I could ever imagine. And two, I respect them more than I ever could imagine. And it's this weird tension
Yep.
of, I read this and I'm like, I totally understand what you're doing right now. And it even makes sense. And I even, perhaps in another world, if I, grew up in Germany in 1835, I would have been right there with you. And now, from the historic vantage point of, 200 years later, like, wow, this was wrong. And,
This does not fit 2025 whatsoever. I mean,
it,
it's not to put too fine a point of it, but you know, it shouldn't be surprising that the mindset of a person who's living right around the time of the Civil War is not in sync with the mindset of us in the 21st century. That was a long time ago. So yeah, no, I mean, immense disagreement with the perspectives of these early reformers. But if they're trying to help Jews be able to feel comfortable within societies where they are very much not tolerated, even in the most basic senses, I get what they're doing there. Not what I need to do today, but I can appreciate it for what it is. But then for Jews in 21st century to cling on to that as a way of saying, listen, I'm just like all of the people who founded the Reform movement. There's nothing wrong with being anti-Semitic. I can't fathom for a moment that sorry, not a problem with being anti-Zionist. I can't fathom for a moment that the early reformers, if they lived today, would have the same sense of anti-Zionism that they had back then, because they would recognize that the world is very different.
Yeah. So every year at my, family's Passover Seder, my brother and I, switch off nights with topics. So, and we try to get, we're all a bunch of, nerds. So we try to pick, these very obscure academic-y topics. So this year, my brother talked about, Orthodox anti-Zionism. And so, he brought in a number of, sources, mostly from the Satmar Rebbe. And, just for listeners, Satmar is the biggest Hasidic sect. People tend to think it's Chabad. Satmar is bigger. It's just much more insular. And, reading these, theological, political arguments against Israel, and these are arguments that are still being made now. And it was just really interesting. And I felt kind of the same way, where I have respect for the theology behind it while also disagreeing with it. And that's actually a very different case study, because these are still people, unlike, and, if you disagree with this classification, let me know, but unlike most American Jewish anti-Zionists that I feel have very little connection to their Jewish identity. Not all, but, there's endless memes about, these JVP Seders where, everything's spelled backwards and people don't know the bracha. And, in some sense, if you're gonna say that Judaism has nothing to do with Zionism and Judaism's just a religion, then you better be practicing of that religion, right? It's sort of odd to say my Jewish identity is just a religion, not connected to this entity, and then someone
But I
says,
don't practice that
"Yeah,
religion.
but I don't practice." It's like, okay, well then, what is the operative Jewish sense about you? It's sort of odd on that level. But with Satmar, I think it's a position that needs to at least be respected, not agreed with, of course, but I think their principled religious opposition, again, I vehemently disagree, but at least, in the scope of, I think if we were sitting here in the year 3000 and teaching a American Jewish history class and talking, or, a Jewish history class and talking about the 20th and 21st century, I don't think the anti-Zionist, I don't think anti-Zionist Jews in the 21st century would be a notable line to study in terms of a Jewish movement. I think it'd be studied as a part of a wider movement of, and some Jews ended up, kind of the same way we think of Jews who converted to Christianity in the 1100s. Yeah, some Jews did this, but most Jews, again, continue to be Jewish. But I do think the religious anti-Zionism would sort of have to be engaged with, because this is still an ongoing debate. It's sort of, percolates within Chabad, even though, Chabad, the Lubavitcher Rebbe had a little, a different perspective than the Satmar Rebbe, but still, engaging with, okay, what exactly are we doing here? Or, is this a messianic movement? Is this, instead of a messianic movement? So I just thought it was interesting, that we spent our entire Passover night talking about this.
Well, and I think one of the other key differences here, right? I think a fair critique to make against politically progressive anti-Zionist Jews, it doesn't invalidate their perspective. However, I think you could say that they are generally motivated by their political identity, and then their religious identity, the Jewish piece, fills in around the edges. So the primary lens out of which they're seeing is their political lens. I don't think you could make that critique for Satmar Hasidim, right? their anti-Zionism comes out of a primarily religious lens that happens to look like certain political things, but that's not what guides them there. So I think that's also a noteworthy shift between the two.
And also Satmar, I mean, the group of, there's two groups of American Jews that spend the most amount of time talking about Israel. They are, you know, mostly secular American Jews that are all in on Israel, and that's their entire Jewish identity, which, I think is less than ideal. And then they are progressive anti-Zionists. The vast majority of American Jews that are somewhere in the middle. I mean, I deeply care about Israel. I live there. I take students to Israel once or twice a year, but Israel probably takes up about 10% of my ongoing thinking and acting about Judaism. I mean, the past week I've talked about Passover for 5 times as long as I've talked about Israel. And I've talked about, I'm teaching a class on Jewish law. I've thought about, Talmud and Maimonides, and so there is somewhat of an irony for Judaism has nothing to do with Israel, but the only thing I'm going to use my Jewish identity for is talking about Israel. It's like, you know, if Judaism, because I would say Judaism has nothing to do with the New Testament, right? I think I can affirm that statement. And I spend very little time, I don't spend my entire
Right.
day unpacking the New Testament and why this makes no sense. That would be sort
And
of
because it
odd if I
doesn't
did,
matter.
because it
That's
does.
not the central part. That's not the central part.
Exactly, right. So if
Um,
something doesn't matter, like it doesn't matter. And so I do think that is an interesting irony as well.
what's funny is that I historically have said that Israel and Zionism are parts of my Jewish identity, but they're relatively peripheral. Um, like I would assign it a similar percent. Like 10% of my Jewish identity is based on my Zionism or my connection to Israel. It's an important 10%. I couldn't just cut it off, but it's not what I would spend most of my time thinking about until the last couple of years, where suddenly I think for a lot of folks in the Jewish community, it's like you can't get away from this topic. And I think part of that too is pushed by this internal debate that we have. And not that I'm not afraid of the internal debate. I think it's a healthy thing. Not the way that we might not be having it in a healthy way, but for it to exist is healthy. Um, but it puts, I think, many, many Jews in this uncomfortable position where the piece of their identity that might be one of the smaller ones suddenly is inescapable. I know I struggle with that plenty.
Yeah, I think, and for me, and I think this is maybe what separates, I think, some facets of the Jewish community is the identity, my Zionism and connection with Israel, it's a lot more fluid with the rest of my Jewish identity. And I see with a lot of students that have, you know, shallower Jewish identities. I don't mean that in like it's shallow, but people who grow up and go to public school and maybe have never really engaged with Jewish identity past having to suffer through having a b'nai mitzvah, and so for them everything is sort of very bifurcated. It's you know their memories from synagogue and services, and then separately their memory of that one time they went to Israel with their family 10 years ago, and then that's bifurcated from their experience in Hillel having or and Chabad on campus having social interactions. And there isn't this type of fluidity that I think I grew up in the de facto modern Orthodox, but it's essentially the religious Zionist community, where at a certain point there ceased to be a real difference of where one started and where one ended. Obviously, if somebody were to engage me in high school in a conversation of the 6 Day War, that would be a different part of my brain than if somebody were to engage me on, I don't know, the laws of kosher. But it was a lot more fluid in the sense of, we never really had this tension of, well, I want to be a part of the Jewish community, but then there's this Zionism piece that I don't really know how to make sense of. And I see a lot of people struggle with that. And again, part of it makes sense, but to me, it almost makes sense the same way, that I, love the Talmud. I'm sort of, it's sort of my favorite Jewish thing to talk about is not Israel and Zionism. It's Talmud. And I love it knowing full well that 5% of statements in the Talmud are either just factually incorrect or, against the sensibilities. I had mentioned the sexism before. you know, again, this was a text that was compiled by a, group of 99% men, yeah, shout out to, the couple, Hulda and Bruria and, all those, incredible sage women. But, there's a reason why that's sort of viewed as so important, because, there's almost no female representation. And so I just think that that's, you almost take it with the whole package. It's like, I love Talmud. And then every time these things come up, it's okay, let's try to unpack it rather than me saying, I really want to engage with the Talmud, but there's this 5%, and this is making it difficult for me to engage in this wider sea of Talmud. And it's just hard to see it from that perspective. But I do think that's how a lot of people are approaching Israel, rather than, taking the whole as a part of their identity and then saying, okay, within this whole, there's going to be, if you do Daf Yomi, every week you're going to come across something and you're going to be like, what the heck were they thinking? Just the same way, if I every morning read, Times of Israel, more often than not, what the hell were they thinking? They did what? That's crazy. But it's not really a threat to my overall, connection to Israel or Zionism, the same way coming across, you know, those statements in Maimonides or the Talmud are going to say, oh, do I really like this, wider tradition? So I don't know, just some food for thought there.
I'm curious what you think about with this because I've seen sort of a shift, and I'm especially given the work that you do, I'm curious how you see it affecting people who are coming of age right now. Um, there was this classical thinking. I mean, it's recent classical. That one of the cardinal sins that we had been committing as educators in the Jewish space was that we taught, Israel utopia. That and we never talked about the blemishes about Israel's identity, and that was causing people who then learned about those later in life to, the house of cards fell down. So then I think Jewish educators have very much abandoned in most spaces that kind of flawless Israel is utopia picture. Um, and the reason for that historically, the reason we moved away from the former picture, aside from the fact that it's just not right, was this assumption that that's a more resilient picture of Israel that we're building for young people, that we're teaching them about how messed up Israel, like every other country in the world is, and their identities won't fracture the first time they get to college, let's say, and they hear somebody say Israel committed X, Y, or Z atrocity. It's like, well, and so has the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Spain. My assumption, I mean, just from the peripheral work I do, is that that theory has not borne out, which is that we've taught blemished Israel now for, probably 15, 20, 25 years. It hasn't made, I think, for a lot of people, any more of a resilient identity with Israel, being fluid into the rest of their Jewish self-conception. What do you think?
Ooh, it's a good question. I am I guess I have two thoughts. They might contradict each other, which I guess is
The
not
best kind of
abnormal
Jewish
when it comes to
thoughts.
it.
Yeah.
Exactly. One, I do think that at least for the sort of star students that I've met, throughout the years in Hillel, that for them having engaged with sort of the trickier or dark side of Israel has made them more effective thinkers, educators on Israel. Now a lot of them are working in the Jewish world, and I can kind of see how those experiences have actually bolstered their nuance,
Hmm.
and it certainly has for me too. Like, listen, when I was 18, I couldn't tell you anything about why one would criticize the settlements. I mean,
Right.
all of my family who lives in Israel live over the Green Line. For me, I didn't even, I mean, I knew conceptually what the Green Line was growing up, but for me, it was, there was no difference effectively. And, and now, whatever my, thoughts are about it, I at least can, give you the strong anti-settlement argument and not think, and somebody who is equally anti-settlement would not say, oh, I'm just straw manning, regardless of where I come out at the other end. Um, but on the other hand, I think perhaps the study of Israel, because there's so much. I mean, this, another one of the statements that might get me in trouble. I hear all the time from Jewish organizations that want to partner with Hillel, and their main goal is something around helping, now high school students prepare themselves for college by putting them through these crash course advocacy things in Israel, where it's essentially, you're going to hear this phrase that Israel, struck first in 1967. Here are 4 facts why this is wrong. And I'm thinking, okay, one, I don't know if that type of education works in general, but I think even more importantly, it's just not what I think our students need necessarily. Like, I would much rather a student, I actually think counterintuitively, if a high school student, if somehow this can be packaged in a way that doesn't sound, awful and boring, if a high school student spends 20 weeks studying, you know, Maimonides or, you know, Hasidic literature or Talmud, I actually think that their Jewish identity in college in the face of, anti-Zionism will be stronger than 20 weeks of crash course Zionism because it's just, I think when we isolate Israel and, there's, the Jewish part and then there's the Israel part and, we're going to educate people to be the Israel part, then that does allow for the separation that I think anti-Zionists want to leverage. And you do get to the point where a lot of people are saying, well, I don't really know, I don't want to associate with the Jewish community because of anti-Zionism versus almost the other side, which is whatever one thinks about Israel, 90% of Jewish communal life has nothing to do with it. And so, yeah, that stuff's important, but I almost think it's the wrong direction. And I would want to see actually less, for everyone who's pouring in, tens of millions of dollars, which is, ongoing right now to, advocacy, Israel advocacy, prep or whatever. There's such a little, I always joke that, if we wanted to get money for Hillel, this is, still true now, especially after October 7th. If we wanted to do a weekend of Israel advocacy, we can raise the money, like this. There's so many organizations that want to slap their name on it. But if I wanted to take 20 students for, a retreat in the weekend and do, a traditional, Shabbaton and, tech study and whatever, that's a lot harder to get money for, which is sort of bewildering because at the end of the day, even if all one cares about is Jewish students being connected to Israel, which is not all I care about, but even if somebody's a donor and says, well, at the end of the day, that's all I care about, I still think the Shabbaton and traditional tech study will actually make them, quote unquote, more connected to Israel and everything there. And I think, again, just from my vantage point of having grown up in the Orthodox community where we never had any formal, there was never anything in high school where it was, let's talk about Israel as a state. It was so fluid and it just came across. And now it's at the point where, even if somebody says a statement, oh, Israel has nothing to do with Judaism, I don't know that's wrong because I saw some slideshow of, well, in the 11th century, Judah
Right,
Halevi
right.
wrote this poem. And, it's just because, studying Tanakh and Talmud and medieval Jewish literature, it's just like,
It's
wait, are these people,
self-evident.
like,
Yeah.
do these people not understand that this is just ubiquitous within not just all of our texts, but all of our prayers and whatever? So I don't know. That's sort of more the holistic picture. I mean, again, at the end of the day, this sounds very nice. If you have an hour to talk with people, you have to pick something. You can't just say, we're going to touch on, everything. But, I would almost because and I've done this before. This was much to the surprise. 2 years ago, I was asked to lead a conversation with high school seniors, local high school seniors, about Israel on campus, and I brought them. There's a debate in the Tractate of Talmud Ketubot, which deals with marriages, about unpacking, one of the things that the Mishnah states is that if either the wife or the husband decide that they want to move to Israel and the other one doesn't, that's grounds for a divorce and you don't have to pay the ketubah, which essentially means, you have, this is one of the things that you can just, okay, bam, there's something more important than, the marriage lasting, which is one of them moving to Israel. Irregardless of the morals of that, which, maybe we'd want to amend that today, you know, just the fact that in Babylonia, and this is what I wanted to spell out to students, in the year 450 in Iraq, in, Pumbedita, there were rabbis that were, the most important thing for rabbis was, pushing marriages. And, this was, obviously,
They
a
would do
huge
anything to
cornerstone of
save a
Judaism is
marriage.
exactly, even to the extent, erasing God's name as the Talmud, explicates, so great is, peace between a man and a woman that even God's name can be erased. The rabbis say that in regards to the Sota ritual. And so the fact that they are willing to say, well, one side wants to move to Israel, okay, I guess the marriage isn't meant to be because the other one doesn't want to go. And, I was sort of unpacking that with students, and that obviously led into a conversation about what is our connection to Israel today. American Jews asking, wait, should we be moving to Israel? Which, of course, wasn't the push, but I think at least should be a question of, it is weird that, last week we all said Lashana Haba Yerushalayim next year in Jerusalem, knowing full well both me and you can easily, you know, move to Israel. It's probably the easiest it's ever been in Jewish history for anyone to move in Israel. And yet I know full well I will not be living in Jerusalem, by next year Passover, and will say next year in Jerusalem again, without any tinge of irony. So, just kind of engaging with all that past, here are 5 facts to refute the 5 facts somebody might counter at you on campus.
Yeah, I think certainly Jewish identity in this sense. I think about the Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim, like the next year thing, when we know full well we don't mean it in a literal sense. Um, it is pretty striking. What you say, the focusing just on this one compartmentalized thing, what it makes me think of is actually how often Jews in progressive spaces will talk about and do things like Tikkun Olam, even, where you have like the special days on which you focus on certain Jewish activities, which only underscores the fact that they're not really integrated into the rest of the identity. Which I think is certainly something that's a general failing in Jewish education. Not because we shouldn't find ways to fill in the gaps. If we haven't done Israel enough, I guess having the Israel day is better than not having any Israel. But it really does lay bare that we have failed some of our students in particular ways. And so for, those progressive Jewish students who are talking about something like Tikkun Olam, one of the things I struggle with all the time is that it almost stands separate from any other Jewish education they've received. They know it's part of the Jewish package, and they'll speak in Jewish language to talk about why, social justice matters. But they haven't integrated into the rest of their Jewish framework in a way that gives them, Torah values and texts and liturgy to speak to why it actually matters in a more holistic sense. So it's interesting that you mentioned that about Israel, because I can think of at least one other topic where we do that.
No, interesting. Yeah. So I know we've been talking for a while. It's always, I always feel the clock ticking on Fridays. I know you're also a couple hours ahead of us.
I don't
Anything
wear a
else that we
tie
didn't
every
talk
day.
about?
Yeah.
There we go. And any other topics that we didn't touch? Any other, thoughts or anything?
No, this has been such a fascinating conversation, and I appreciate you taking the time for it.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Well, thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.
Sounds good. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, my friend.